Alexandra Eala, 13 years old, a young talent from the Philippines, stood before an opportunity that could change her entire life. A girl promising enough to step into the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain, a dream big enough to pull her thousands of kilometers away, and a decision far too large for a child still at an age when most of her friends returned home to their parents every day. But behind that opportunity was a story that was not glamorous but painful. Leaving the Philippines at only 13 years old, living far from her parents, learning to turn a strange place into her home. The days arranged around school, training and tennis, while the future remained completely uncertain. A suitcase can carry clothes, tennis shoes, rackets and school books, but no suitcase can carry the daily presence of parents, familiar meals or the feeling that after a tiring day one can still return to the house where one grew up. What makes that story even more haunting is that Alexandra was not forced to leave. She wanted this opportunity. For the 13-year-old girl at that time, Spain meant better practice courts, stronger opponents, and a wider path leading toward the professional dream. Only when she grew older and looked back did she understand the strangeness of what she had done. She had moved out at 13, left home at the age of 13, and that is perhaps the most ruthless thing about big decisions when we are still too young. It is not that we know whether we are choosing right or wrong, but that we cannot yet know how many years it will take before we receive the answer. When Alexandra left the Philippines, no titles waited for her ahead. No WTA ranking guaranteed that the sacrifice would be rewarded. No one could promise that the years away from family would lead to a professional career. At that time there was only a 13-year-old girl, an opportunity too large to refuse, and a future still unwritten. And before knowing where that path would take her, Alexandra Eala had to accept the first thing the dream demanded. To go further in tennis, she had to go far from home. If the story of Alexandra Eala's quiet sacrifice makes you want to know what truly shaped that girl, please subscribe to the channel and walk with us to the end of this journey. I'll mention this just once. I've gathered these unforgettable sports stories, trivia and memories into a book called The Golden Age of Sports Trivia for Seniors. If it sounds like something you'd enjoy, the link is in the comments. Before Spain appeared as a turning point, tennis had already quietly taken over nearly all of Alexandra Eala's days. When she was only about 11 or 12 years old, her life already ran according to a rhythm that very few friends her age had to experience. Mornings began while it was still dark. Around 4:45, she woke up, prepared for physical training from about 5 in the morning, then returned for an entirely different task, going to school like a normal student. But when the final bell of the day rang, her day was still not over. Ahead still lay tennis, the hours of practice on court, then homework and the academic responsibilities that had to be finished before sleeping. After that she woke up and did almost all of it again the next day. The harshness did not lie in one early morning or one long training session, it lay in the repetition, day after day, week after week. While other children could decide what they wanted to do after school, Alexandra's time was increasingly decided by a goal that still lay very far away. Tennis had not yet taken her out of the Philippines, but it had already begun taking the first thing an elite athlete must learn to sacrifice, the freedom over her own time. Extra mornings of sleep became rare. Unplanned afternoons had to give way to training. School, fitness, tennis, homework and recovery were no longer separate parts of life. They began crowding against one another until nearly every hour of the day had a task. And then another problem appeared. Training hard in one place was not enough. To know how good she really was, Alexandra needed stronger opponents, bigger tournaments and tests that could not be found by remaining forever in a familiar environment. Junior tennis therefore began pulling her into international trips, tournament calendars, and a life in which school had to learn to exist beside training and travel. A tournament did not only occupy a few hours on court, it could change an entire week, affect the school schedule, the training schedule, and the plans of the people around her. Alexandra began understanding very early a cold truth of elite sport. Talent only gives you the right to enter the race, and if you want to know where your limits lie, you must continually seek out people strong enough to push you to those limits. That was when the life of an ordinary teenager and the life of a teenager aiming for elite sport began running on two different clocks. One measured in school days, weekends and holidays, the other measured in training blocks, tournament dates and opportunities that do not wait. Before Alexandra left the Philippines, tennis had already taken nearly all the time in her day, but then that dream prepared to demand a far greater sacrifice. It no longer wanted only the hours of Alexandra's day, it began demanding the distance between her and her home. To go further in tennis, Alexandra Eala soon had to face a truth that was not easy to accept. There are dreams that cannot fully develop if they are kept only in the safest place. The Philippines had given her a foundation, family, identity, and the first years to love tennis. But if the goal was to become a professional player strong enough to compete at the international level, the issue was no longer only how hard one worked. It was also whom one trained with, whom one competed against, how many sufficiently strong opponents one met in a year, how many suitable tournaments there were to test one's level, and whether each failure truly forced one to upgrade one's game. In Europe, especially in the major tennis centers, those factors lie much closer together: specialized coaching, sports science, fitness, recovery, international junior events, and a density of opponents high enough that a young talent does not have to wait too long for the next test. For a young player in the Philippines, geographic distance itself became part of the equation. Wanting stronger competition often meant having to fly farther, stay longer, adjust the school schedule more, and turn travel into a part of the development process rather than an exception. That is the great paradox of Eala's journey. Talent can be born anywhere, but the opportunities to continually test and sharpen that talent are not evenly distributed. A child in Europe can step into many levels of competition within a relatively close range. A child in the Philippines wanting to follow a similar path may have to leave the country frequently from a very early age. And then in 2018, what had previously existed only as a vague possibility suddenly became a real choice. Eala's results at Les Petits, the prestigious junior tournament in France, brought her into the attention of the Rafa Nadal Academy. There is no need to turn that victory into a tear-filled destiny moment. What mattered more was that after it, the door the family had only been able to imagine began to open. Eala later recalled that her father mentioned the opportunity in a very ordinary moment while driving her to school. No stage, no announcement ceremony, only a conversation in the car about a decision that could change all the years ahead in her life. For Alex, the idea was almost too attractive to refuse. An academy bearing the name of Rafael Nadal, a better training environment, stronger opponents, a system in which tennis no longer had to be fitted into life, but became the center of it. But for the parents, the question was far more complicated. They did not only have to ask whether the academy was good for tennis, they had to ask whether a 13-year-old child could live in a boarding system, far from parents, adapt to another country, and still keep balance among academics, personal development, and career ambition. Therefore, the family did not make the decision from a single invitation. They went to Spain to try the environment for a period of time, see how the system operated, and whether Alex truly fitted that life. This detail is very important, because the story is not about parents pushing their daughter away because of results. It is the story of a family trying to check everything before accepting a choice that no one can make halfway. Miko's also going helped make the decision more feasible. At least Alexandra would not step into a completely unfamiliar environment without any part of the family beside her. The scholarship solved part of the financial problem and opened the professional door, but it could not solve the larger thing. Mallorca was still thousands of kilometers from home, and in the end, that was the essence of the decision. The family did not have to choose between loving Alex and letting her go, precisely because they loved her, understood the seriousness of the dream, and knew that keeping her close could mean keeping her path smaller. They had to accept a more painful paradox. Sometimes supporting a child does not mean keeping the child close, but having enough courage to let the child go to the place where she has the chance to become the person she herself wants to become. When Alexandra Eala stepped into the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, the biggest change was not that she suddenly had to train more. Tennis had already occupied most of her days before that. The real change was that from then on, tennis no longer had to squeeze into the middle of life. Nearly the entire life began to be built to serve tennis. The Rafa Nadal Academy does not operate as a place where students come for a few hours each day and then return home. It is a closed ecosystem where residence, school, practice courts, gym, conditioning, recovery, coaches, and academic support all exist in one space and all aim toward one goal: turning young players with potential into athletes capable of surviving in the professional environment. For Alexandra, this meant the school calendar could not be separated from the tournament calendar. A school exam, a training week, a competition trip, and a recovery day were no longer independent parts. They had to be placed beside one another, adjusted with one another, and sometimes yield to one another. If a tournament lasted longer than expected, studies had to adapt. If the body needed recovery, training had to change. If a new technique needed more time to refine, the competition plan also had to be reconsidered. Tennis at this level was no longer simply stepping onto the court and hitting balls for 2 hours. It became a chain of connected work: technical work to fix every detail in the stroke, tactical work to understand when to attack, when to defend, how to construct a point, and how to read the opponent, movement to move more efficiently, strength and conditioning so the body could endure consecutive weeks of competition, recovery so that the next day one could still step onto the court with sufficiently high quality, preparation to know what the opponent likes, dislikes, and what one needs to change before the match. A match, therefore, does not truly end when the umpire says game, set, match. Afterward, there is still the review: what was done well, what went wrong, how the body reacted, and what the next practice session needs to correct. It is here that Alexandra began shifting from a girl with talent into a person who had to understand how to operate the life of an athlete. Before that, many parts of the routine were still organized by the family and kept on rhythm. At the academy, she gradually had to understand why she did each thing, had to take more responsibility herself for time, body, studies, and attitude in training. Discipline was no longer only about being present on time. It became the ability to repeat the right things over many months, many seasons, even when there was no major tournament immediately ahead to create motivation. The interesting thing is that that environment did not overwhelm Alexandra in the way people might imagine. She was already used to days that began very early in the Philippines. Some mornings at the academy even began later than the routine she had lived before. Therefore, the challenge was not proving she could endure a heavy training day. She had known that for a long time. The larger challenge was turning discipline into a system that could be maintained year-round without performance collapsing. A young athlete can train extremely hard for a few weeks. Elite sport demands that she know how to train correctly over many years. Boarding also changed the structure of life in a very practical way. When school, tennis, and residence all lay within the campus, the gaps between studying and training almost disappeared. Tennis was present when she stepped onto the court, but it was also present in the way the school day was arranged, in the decision whether the weekend could be used for a tournament or recovery, in the travel plans, and in the way the body had to be cared for in order to continue training. This is a very large advantage for development because everything is connected, but it simultaneously made the boundary between a student who plays tennis and a tennis player who still has to go to school increasingly blurred. Alexandra began living closer to the second definition. Another important change was the way she encountered competition. In an elite environment, the person on the other side of the net in practice is not only a partner, they can represent the speed, power, and standard she will have to face at international tournaments. A bad practice session is no longer only a bad practice session, it becomes data. An error that repeats many times is not only annoying, it becomes something the coaching staff must solve before an opponent exploits it in a real match. Precisely that level of detail makes professional development different from simply playing more tennis. Rafael Nadal is of course the name that overshadows the academy, But Alexandra's story is not the story of Nadal standing beside her every morning and directly building each stroke. Nadal is the symbol of a philosophy of discipline, competition, and professionalism. The daily development process of Eala took place within a system consisting of many different coaches, trainers, academic staff, and specialists. What mattered was not that she was chosen by a legend and then everything happened naturally. What mattered was that she stepped into a place designed to eliminate as many gaps as possible between potential and preparation. And Alexandra had to live long enough inside that structure for those habits to become a part of herself. As the years passed, Mallorca was no longer a place she came to test herself for a few months. Eala continued studying and training at the academy, then completed her high school program there. That detail says more than any description about how deeply the decision at age 13 changed her life. This was not a long training camp. This was the place where her high school years actually took place, where school reports, training plans, and tournament results existed in the same life. In Quezon City, tennis once had to find a place in a day that already had school, homework, and family. In Mallorca, the entire day was built around tennis, and from that moment, Alexandra Eala was no longer only learning how to play the sport she loved. She began learning how to live as a person whose future could depend on every small detail of that very life. Alexandra Eala was not completely alone when her life moved to Spain. Miko was also in the same system. Her parents still followed closely, the extended family still watched every step, and distance never meant she was left behind. But that is precisely what makes Alexandra's story painful in a more subtle way. The most important people were still there, only they were no longer present in every morning, every meal, every return after a tiring day as before. From then on, family no longer always meant being in the same place. Sometimes it was a phone call, sometimes a live stream screen, sometimes only the live score numbers that parents and relatives looked at from the Philippines, trying to imagine what was happening on a court thousands of kilometers away. Alexandra once said that no matter where she competed, the family still tried to follow through live stream or live score updates. That is a very small image, but it says a great deal about her new life. A match can take place in Europe. Emotions can surge on the court, while the people she most wants to share with are looking at everything through a screen back home. At 15 years old, when Eala won her first professional title in Mallorca, what was memorable was not only the trophy. After the victory, she wanted to call her family. That was a very natural reflex, but precisely because it was natural, it carried even more meaning. Success happened in Spain, while the feeling of home still immediately pointed toward the Philippines. The years away from home did not weaken the bond, they only forced that bond to find another way to exist. And then the COVID-19 pandemic appeared, turning a distance that was already hard to measure into an entirely new form of uncertainty. Alexandra had left the Philippines to step into an environment that helped her compete more, meet stronger opponents, and build a future in tennis. But suddenly international tennis nearly stopped. Tournaments disappeared from the calendar, schools switched to online form, plans that had once been calculated in weeks, tournaments and flights became empty spaces no one knew how long would last. For a teenager already used to every day pointing toward a next goal, the silence of the calendar could be a challenge entirely different from losses on court. Not because Alexandra did not know how to train, but because for the first time the path ahead had no clear dates. No one knew when competition would return, when the suspended plans could continue, or how much time a young athlete in a developmental stage would lose because a world was closing. And precisely in periods like that, Eala had to learn something that no ranking can measure: how to continue living with a choice when the reward of that choice temporarily disappears from view. Growing up far from family is therefore not only missing home, it is learning how to handle a loss without being able simply to walk through the door and see parents right in front of her. It is having to communicate clearly with the people working with her, taking more responsibility herself for time, studies, trips, and the small decisions of each day. It is understanding that when the tournament calendar changes, the rest of life must also change accordingly. For an international athlete, the weekend is not always a weekend. A holiday no longer depends entirely on the school calendar, and returning home is no longer simply finishing a day and going home. Home gradually became something that had to be placed into the schedule. A gap between two tournaments, a training period that allowed rest, a flight that could be arranged, an opportunity to return to the Philippines before the circuit began pulling her away again. This is perhaps one of the largest changes that few people see when a child steps into elite sport. Distance is not only calculated in kilometers. It is calculated in the times one has to say, after this tournament, after next week, when the schedule allows. Family occasions, meetings, and time at home do not disappear completely, but they increasingly depend on a calendar system that Alexandra cannot control alone. And that itself forced her to mature faster in her understanding of presence. There are people who love us not because they always stand beside us, but because they are still there even if they can only follow from afar. There are families that no longer share every day, but still share the same journey. For Alexandra, distance never meant she belonged less to the family. It only forced both her and the people in the Philippines to learn a new definition of being together. Not always the same house, the same time zone, or the same stands, but still looking in the same direction. When Alexandra Eala had truly moved her life to Spain, her tennis dream was no longer the story of a lone child trying by herself to push against the whole world. A career like that cannot be built by a single person. Behind every competition week, every flight, every change of school schedule, every decision about training, and every period of having to start again after failure, is a network of people who keep everything continuing to operate. For Riza, the support for her daughter was not only encouragement after victories. Because she herself had lived in a competitive sports environment, she understood that a young athlete needs a place to return to emotionally. A person calm enough not to turn a win into too many expectations, and also not to turn a loss into a disaster. Sometimes supporting a child in elite sport also means accepting the decisions that an ordinary mother might most want to avoid. Letting the child live far away. Letting others coach the child every day, and trusting that distance does not weaken the family relationship. Mike held a different role, appearing less on the court, but no less necessary. An international junior career is not only tennis. It also has plane tickets, schedules, tournament entries, travel times, last-minute changes, and a series of practical decisions that must be handled so the young athlete can focus only on what she has to do when she steps onto the court. If those parts are not organized well, the pressure off the court can quickly destroy the work on the court. Mike's contribution therefore lay largely in consistency, keeping the complicated parts of the journey from becoming a new crisis every week. Miko brought another kind of stability. His also stepping into the Spanish environment meant Alexandra did not have to begin a new life without any piece of the family beside her. That presence did not erase the distance from the parents, but it made the transition less absolute. Even so, both siblings still had to develop their own paths. Belonging to the same family does not mean the same career, the same ranking, or the same future. Precisely that forced Alexandra gradually to separate from the safety of being only Miko's younger sister in order to take responsibility for her own tennis. And then there are the people whose names audiences almost never see on the scoreboard: the coaching staff, the trainers, the people in charge of fitness, recovery, and tournament planning. Moving from a junior with potential to a professional player does not only require better technique, it requires a system that can see the problems before they become limits. Which stroke needs adjustment, how the body is handling the load, which competition schedule is suitable, when one needs to move up to a higher level, and when one must step back to build the foundation. All of that support is important, but it also has a very clear limit. The family can buy plane tickets. The academy can provide courts. The coach can provide a plan. The trainer can prepare the body. Relatives can remind her that a failure does not define who she is. But when the match begins, no one can hit a ball in place of Alexandra. No one can bear the pressure of a break point in her place. No one can make a decision in a rally in her place. No one can turn a bad day into a victory with only love or preparation. That is where all support must stop, and personal responsibility begins. Precisely for that reason, Eala's story does not become smaller when acknowledging that she has a system behind her. On the contrary, it shows more clearly what she had to do: turn all the opportunities, time, knowledge, and trust of others into her own performance. The people around her can keep the path from collapsing, but Alexandra is still the one who must take each step on it. And then there will come a stage when even a stable family, a top academy, and a good team cannot promise the result in advance. Because moving from an outstanding junior to professional tennis is the moment when all the things that once helped her advance can only take her to the door. To stay on the other side of that door, Alexandra had to prove herself that she could win against adults, earn ranking points one by one, and turn potential into a real career. Junior tennis can show how good a young player is compared with those of the same age, but professional tennis poses a far colder question. Can you step onto the court against adults, players already used to making a living match by match, and then continue earning ranking points week after week? Alexandra Eala began understanding that difference very early. The junior doubles titles at the Australian Open and Roland Garros showed she belonged to the top talent group of her generation. But they were still only signals. By the US Open Junior 2022, when she won the girls' singles title, everything seemed to have an answer. A Grand Slam, a historic milestone, evidence that the years of training in Spain had not been meaningless. But professional tennis does not open its doors simply because you once won a junior Grand Slam. The next day, the WTA ranking is still there, cold and uninterested in the past. A junior champion still has to step down to the smaller events, enter qualifying, meet older, more experienced opponents, and learn almost from the beginning how to survive in a system that awards no bonus points for reputation. That was the period from 2021 to 2024, the less glamorous years that nevertheless decided whether Alexandra could truly turn talent into a profession. The ITF women's circuit became the place where she had to learn the lessons that junior tennis could not fully teach. A tournament week is not only stepping onto the court and trying to win the first match. It is how to manage the body across many days, understanding when to conserve energy, when to push intensity, how to recover after a long match, and then prepare for the next opponent almost immediately. It is accepting that a good week can push the ranking up a little, but a few failed weeks can leave everything almost standing still. Ranking in professional tennis does not rise in a straight line. It opens and closes doors. Standing at a certain position can help you enter a small draw directly. A little higher, you can avoid qualifying. Higher still, the larger events begin to appear. But every time a door opens, behind it is a harder level. A small title does not end the struggle, it only grants the right to step into a room where stronger opponents are already waiting. Alexandra had to learn to live with that logic. Debut 15, debut 25, then the higher-level events are not names that attract the general public, but it is precisely there that professional credibility is built. A young player can be praised for potential, but the tour only believes in what can be repeated. How many matches can you win? Can you do it on different surfaces? How do you react after a bad week? Can you return to qualifying the next week without letting the previous failure drag you down? Those questions appear continuously, and none of them can be solved by the US Open Junior Trophy alone. There were periods when Alexandra won enough to move forward, then again met weeks that created no significant change on the ranking list. There were times she drew closer to the larger main draws, but still not enough to be regarded as an established WTA player. This is the harsh part of the transition. The world may already know you were once a junior champion, but you still have to prove you belong at the professional level almost every week. By 2024, the W100 title in Vitoria-Gasteiz became an important step forward because it was no longer only a victory at a low developmental level. It showed Alexandra beginning to win against opponents at a higher professional level, beginning to accumulate results of greater weight and moving closer to the ranking zone that could change her own calendar. But even then, she was still not a stable name in the larger WTA events. The career was still being built layer by layer, with no magical leap that erased the previous years. And then Miami 2025 appeared. A wild card put Alexandra into a major tournament at the exact moment when many years of accumulation had finally created enough foundation for that opportunity to matter. The victories in that week pushed her past a threshold she had been chasing for many seasons, the top 100. To outsiders, the breakthrough seemed to happen in Miami. But the real professional career had been built in the years before that, through qualifying, ITF events, the times the ranking rose only a little, and the weeks that had to start again from the beginning. Miami did not create that player in a few days. It only made the world finally see the person that the quiet years before had shaped. After the top 100, Eala continued improving her position and stepped into higher levels. But the most important thing had changed. Professional tennis was no longer only a possibility she was trying to prove. It had become the life she was truly living. At 13 years old, going to Spain was a gamble on the future. No ranking, no title, no system could guarantee the result. It took many years, through each small level and each unglamorous step forward, before the professional ranking list began to reflect what the family had only been able to believe. And for the first time, that sacrifice had a tangible answer. If one could return to the moment at 13 years old, when the opportunity to go to Spain still lay ahead, and nothing had yet happened, perhaps the hardest question is not whether Alexandra Eala would choose tennis, but whether she would still say yes, as quickly as the girl of that year once said. At that time, the logic was very simple. A better place to train, stronger opponents, a larger environment. An opportunity that very few people receive. For a child already used to living by the training schedule, the answer was almost natural. Go. But at 21 years old, the same decision no longer has only one meaning. It is also boarding, the high school years that passed in Mallorca. The family sometimes having to follow her through live stream and live score. The successive trips, the years of stepping through the ITF, trying to turn junior results into a real career. Looking back, Eala does not need to regret in order to understand that the decision was far larger than the way she once saw it. That is the difference between making a choice and truly understanding that choice. A child can be courageous enough to step through a door only because on the other side is something she wants. Only time shows how many other rooms that door leads to, how many other responsibilities, and how many other versions of oneself. Rankings and the titles afterward prove that the path Alexandra chose was effective in professional terms. But perhaps the greater achievement does not lie entirely on the ranking list. She has learned to live independently among many environments, learned to take responsibility herself for a profession that began when she was still very young, and understood that elite sport is rarely created by one heroic moment. It is built from thousands of smaller choices. Waking up on time, practicing a technique again, walking past a failure, boarding the next flight, starting a new week, and continuing to choose the path one chose many years earlier. Therefore, this story does not need to end with a trophy, nor with a certain answer that Alexandra would do it all exactly the same if she had the chance. Perhaps what is more worth saying lies in the word home. The Philippines is still the homeland, the place where her identity and family belong. Mallorca became the place where her tennis matured. The professional tour became the place where her work takes place. At 13 years old, Alexandra had to choose a place to go. At 21 years old, perhaps the largest change is that she has understood a life does not necessarily belong to only one place. It can be built between the place one comes from, the place one grows up, and the person one continues to become. If Alexandra Eala's journey makes you appreciate more the quiet sacrifices behind a large dream, please subscribe to the channel so that together we can explore more stories of people who had to trade a great deal to reach the place they wanted to reach. Thank you for walking with us to the end of Alexandra's story, and see you again in the next video.